Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is the prologue and first part of Spitfire on My Tail. In this video series I will tell you the story of Ulrich Steinhilper, a Luftwaffe pilot during the Second World War. Ulrich flew the famous Messerschmitt Me-109, becoming an ace in October of 1940. He wrote down his story in a book of the same name, which was kindly lent to me by a friend. This very book even was signed by the man himself in 2001, and I have recorded and edited its contents to make them accessible in this format. I will provide background information and images relevant to Ulrich's story for you to look at and listen to. Now, join me as we dive into this first-hand account of the Battle of Britain told from the German perspective. Enjoy. Part 1. There were just 8 of us. The total defense for the bomber force. All that could be mustered out of what should have been 3 full squadrons. We were the only survivors. For us, the odds were high and time was running out. The Battle of Britain had cost us dearly. Flying at 10,000 meters or 32,000 feet, we were above the bomb-carrying 109s, which we had been briefed to escort. But even higher than that, at about 11,000 meters or 35,000 feet, were the British fighters. Spitfires with the new Merlin engine, some of them probably fitted with the hard-hitting 20mm cannon. They flew a straight course, their contrails just silver parallel lines, boiling out after a while into a fine mist. But there was no time now for aesthetic reverie. They were the hunters and we, their intended prey. We knew their tactics now as well as they knew ours. It was now routine. We would assemble and set course for London. The British radar would pick us up as we assembled over France and set course, and as we began our flight, so the British pilots would still be taking tea, waiting for the word. As we crossed the channel, they would scramble and climb to their service ceiling, ready to pick us up as we approached London. They would follow us, waiting with the advantage of height and speed, and then, as we began our turn for home, both at the tactically weakest spot and at the extreme of our range, they would peel off and hell would break loose again. We were naturally tense in the combat zone, but today it was worse for me. My 109, the Yellow 2, had mechanical trouble and I was finding it hard to keep up with the wing. Every few seconds I would glance up and see those white lines being carved across the sky, hoping that I would survive the attack when it came. Achtung, sie kommen, sie kommen! Watch out, they're coming, they're coming. The stark warning crackled over the radio, and I felt my pulse quicken. I looked up and to the left to where the British fighters had been. Now there were only contrails boiling out as they curved over my head. Out of the sun! Out of the sun! The warning broke through the babble of voices and static on my headphones. I looked back over my shoulder and saw my faithful wingman, Feldwebel Schieferhofer, flying exactly where the sun was brightest. He had heard the warning and stayed flexible, diving below me and coming up on my left side. I made a steep turn, full throttle, threw my rudder hard around and the stick against my leg. The engine was turning at 2,800 RPM, which was 400 too many. We had to make as much speed as possible. The British fighters were diving towards us. Now, we had our noses pointing towards home and that lifted our morale. Schieferhofer and I took up our positions in the classic Rotte, ready to protect each other's tail when necessary. We'd got some way behind the formation, and unless we could make up the distance, we'd hang like bright plums in the sky. Then the curt warning came again. Out of the sun! Out of the sun! 4 or 5 of the Spitfires dived towards Schieferhofer. My little finger found the radio button on the stick, and I pressed it as I shouted the warning, Lothar, watch it! I made the turn to protect his tail, only to see him turn protectively towards me. Instead of diving away, he was turning to shoot behind my tail. I glanced back into the glaring light and there behind me was a staircase to the sun, a staircase of Spitfires queuing for the attack. The first one already had red flames dancing along the leading edge of his wings as his guns fired. Enough is enough. We were fighting for our lives now and both of us would have to act alone. I dived away and saw that the engine was now turning at 3,300 RPM, the throttle fully open. I couldn't risk the engine blowing up, so at 7,000 meters, or 22,000 feet, I leveled out. Up until then, I hadn't been hit. Or so I hoped. Further down there was a layer of cloud which would hide me on the next dive. I made for the sanctuary. How different things were now that we were fighting for our lives. Just a few hours earlier, before dawn, I had been awakened in my warm bed. At just 22 years of age, getting up on a cold Sunday in October was well down on my list of things that I wanted to do. Still, I stumbled about in the cold tent, gradually dragging my flying clothing on over my warm flannel pyjamas. We were on early alarm, and that meant being at the airfield for dawn. It was cold, and a freezing fog lay heavily over the potato and stubble fields which were our runways. Wafts of steam and wisps of smoke hung around our little canvas village as coffee pots were boiled and some food was cooked. The ground crews stamped around and rubbed their hands in an effort to keep warm as we waited. Pilots chatted in animated bursts of conversation, laughing too easily but with no humor in their eyes, all trying to keep their minds from the mission. Some smoked cigarette after cigarette, their hands shaking as they lit each one from the butt of its predecessor. Few could eat. We waited for Helmut Kühle, the squadron leader, who was at the squadron HQ in the monastery for the morning briefing. We'd been waiting for what seemed to be ages when Kühle suddenly arrived in his car. Now all was urgency, a scramble. This was nothing new, nor were the orders. Protect the fighter bombers, target London. Take off 09:05 hours. We were going to be the second wave, our Gruppe being drawn from 3 squadrons. This should have totaled some 36 aircraft, but due to losses and Kanalkrankheit, we could only muster 8 experienced pilots. Ours would be the most vulnerable position, on top of the wing. Today, I was not to fly my new fighter, Yellow 4, which had the automatic variable pitch propeller. This machine was being kept in for its first major service. We had more aircraft and pilots, and so I was reunited with my old aircraft, Yellow 2. I wasn't too sad. After all, I had earned 5 stripes on the tail of this old Emil. My mechanic, Peter, was happy too. He had a soft spot for this battle, worn 109, and was pleased that his special darling was to fly again. Maybe, Herr Oberleutnant, he said to me, with this one you're more fortunate. With the new one you don't seem to be so lucky. With that, he firmly closed the canopy. I locked the hood and checked my instruments and controls. As usual, my stomach began to churn, and I felt a cold sweat begin to break out down my spine. My hands felt clammy inside my flying gloves, and I couldn't wait to get airborne. Then the sickness and anxiety would go. My mechanic's view was optimistic, but my thoughts were different from his. I didn't agree with our present flying tactics, being tied to the bombers as escorts. The role of the fighter is best in a free hunt, not shackled inflexibly to the bombers. Here, we were sitting ducks and couldn't work nearly so successfully. But now, all was routine. It was really stupid to fly in these waves, as they were called. Every 20 minutes a wave would be assembled and set course for London. They were so regular that the British fighters would climb and wait for us, as if we were a train that was running on time. There, above us, the British fighters would hold position until we were at our weakest tactical position, in the turn, and then down they would come. This day had been exactly like that. We had assembled over France and then set out for London. The weather forecast had been right. Clouds above Kent, London clear. As we approached London, all eyes were on the sky, but there was nothing to see as yet. Seeing nothing of the enemy was worse than being able to keep it in sight. The silence on the headphones did nothing to help, only adding to the tension. Everyone searched the sky in all directions, but with special attention being paid to the rear. Still nothing. Then suddenly my radio crackled into life. Raven calling, 11 o'clock high, 11 o'clock high, condensation trails, same course. Yes, there they were, the British fighters. To the left and above, about 1,000 meters or 3,000 feet higher than us. In my position on top of the wing, I could see them clearly. It really looked quite pretty, quiet and peaceful, with those straight silver condensation trails in contrast against the vivid blue of the sky. At first, they were mathematically parallel. Then, they began to boil out into thin, hazy mist. It was a beautiful scene, but those beautiful birds were just waiting for their time to attack. We had to stay alert if we were to survive that day. What a day this looked like being too. Things had started to go wrong as we reached our operational height for the mission. When we flew at that height, the engine only just gave enough pull, and we constantly changed propeller pitch and RPMs to improve performance. With a flat pitch, we could increase the RPM of the engine and get more pressure from the supercharger. Then, by changing the pitch to a course setting, we could make up some speed. Speed was crucial to us if we were to keep up with the wing. They flew a fairly flat course, but we, as fighter cover, were constantly in movement for better observation and for our own protection. Soon I found that I couldn't change pitch very well. Something was wrong. The probability was that whilst my aircraft had been standing unused on the cold October nights, condensation had begun to gather in the grease of the pitch gear. Now, with the freezing temperature of altitude, the moisture was turning into ice, and this in turn was rendering the pitch gears inoperative. I had thought about turning back, but ruled that out. Too many of us were returning to base with mechanical faults, which curiously seemed to clear just as the wheels touched home base. No, I would have to stick with it. I decided to set the pitch at its flattest. This way I would be able to run the motor at high revs and gain the benefit from the supercharger. It would mean that the motor would have to be running well above the maximum recommended RPM, but this had happened before in combat without total disaster. Nevertheless, it was with some trepidation that I waited for the order to turn for home. We knew that the British fighters would choose that moment to attack. The wing leader had told us over the radio that we would be making a turn to the right, and that suited me and my Rottenhund just fine. It meant that we would be on the inside of the curve and would have to travel the shortest distance. It was always those at the end, the poorest rabbits, which were caught by the hunters. Now, we were at the target point for the fighter bombers, and they nosed down into a shallow dive for the attack. All was noise and confusion on the radio, so many transmission that the reception just became a crazy whistling. In moments it was over and the wing began to turn, but I couldn't believe my eyes. They were turning to the left. There was no time to speculate about what had happened. The British fighters were moving into the attack already. As the wing had turned, we had been left out in the cold, tempting targets for the diving Spitfires. Under the pressure of the attack, we had had to abandon the comparative security of the Rotte and act independently. I didn't know if Lothar Schieferhofer had got away, but it seemed that I had been able to shake the pursuing fighters off. I was taking stock of my position when, bang! There was an explosion at the left side of my fighter, near to the front. The control column shook as something hit the elevators in the tail. For a moment I thought that I'd been hit, but a search of the sky revealed no enemy aircraft. It must be the supercharger, I thought. It turns at about 10 times the speed of the engine, and I had badly over-revved it in my attempt to escape the attack by the British fighters. The supercharger had probably exploded, owing to the over-revving, with pieces of it hitting the control surfaces as they passed to the rear. It didn't look as if this was going to be one of my better days. I checked the instruments and controls to see if there was any obvious damage. All seemed to be working, but I was losing oil from the damaged supercharger. The loss of the charger also meant that I would have to fly lower to get power from the engine. My airspeed was about 700 km per hour or 400 miles per hour in the dive, and I was still weaving from left to right, both for protection and for better observation. I put the nose down and glided towards the cloud layer below at about 2000 meters. Once inside the milky soup of the cloud, I relaxed a little and the control column eased back. In moments, I was out of the blinding brightness of the sun. It pained my eyes, but at least I was able to check my course. With constant sidestepping and weaving, my compass was running wild, and I needed the sun for a definite fix. My experience of this route told me that the sun should be ahead and slightly to the right, and I was reassured to see that my course was about right. Therefore, I let the aircraft slide back into the anonymity of the clouds. I began to check the instruments to get a firm idea of how things were going, and gradually I slid through the cloud. Suddenly I was below it, and I could make out the Thames estuary. I was surprised that I hadn't made more distance, considering the speed at which I'd been flying to escape. Then my heart jumped as I realized that I was flying just above and behind a loose group of hurricanes, flying in the same direction. Now I had to react quickly. He who aims best and shoots first would be the winner. The best defense is attack. I checked the lights, which showed if the guns were armed and ready, and saw that, okay, I had 4 green lights. Then I switched on the gun sight, but it was no use. The windscreen had collected ice in the clouds. What to do? Soon I would be seen. I would have to use the metal emergency sight, and I slid the oxygen mask off for freedom of movement. But now my stomach knotted with real fear. The inside of the cockpit smelled like a steam locomotive. The engine was boiling. My grip tightened on the control column as I gently eased it back and felt the aircraft begin to lift. My eyes were fixed upon the hurricanes. If I was seen, I would be attacked with little or no chance of escape. Slowly, oh so slowly, I climbed back towards the sanctuary of the clouds. And off to a great start, no pun intended, with a new book series on this channel. If you yourself are a new visitor, welcome. If you are a channel regular, hello! Happy to have you around again. Let me know in the comments what you think about this new story and what particular topics I should go into detail during these after-action reports. As for this episode, we have learned a bit about propeller pitch control. Back then in the early days, the pilots had to manually control many aspects of the engine during flight, throttle, mixture, propeller pitch and sometimes even supercharger RPM. This adds a lot of workload to the pilot, especially during dogfighting. You had to constantly adjust all 4 variables to get the best performance out of the engine, depending on temperature, altitude and speed, and you could easily damage the power plant by giving wrong inputs. With the 109, automatic pitch control was standard very early on, as we've learned, which meant you just set the desired engine RPM and the propeller pitch was adjusted automatically. What you should do automatically is soothe the algorithm gods by liking, commenting and subscribing, and I will see you in the next episode. Cheers.